I have paid for this bride. Now, this is mine.
He has ruined my whole life.
The night was quiet, but her heart was not. Every step toward the wedding felt like walking deeper into a tunnel where light could no longer reach. The world called a union, a moment of joy, but she knew better. What waited for her was not a celebration. It was a passage into fear. In old villages, weddings were never simply about two hearts meeting. They were doors locked by custom, doors that trapped young women inside rituals older than memory. A bride was not asked if she wished to step through. She was pushed, guided by the cold hands of tradition, bound by the watchful eyes of her family, and weighed down by the expectations of an entire village. The veil that covered her face was not only cloth, it was shadow, it was silence, it was a warning. For many brides, the veil marked the first moment of surrender. Once lowered, it did not simply hide her beauty, it erased her. Behind the fabric, she was no longer a daughter, no longer herself, but an offering. The veil told her that she was leaving behind freedom and stepping into a life of control. The villagers might smile, the drums might sound, but beneath the music, she could hear whispers. Whispers that reminded her of the brides who had walked before her, the ones who returned broken or never returned at all. In some corners of the world, the path to marriage began with terror. The night before the ceremony, brides were shut away in rooms, isolated from everyone they knew. Candles flickered as elders circled them, chanting warnings disguised as blessings. Some were forbidden food or water, told that purity required hunger. Others were scratched with thorns or whipped with branches to drive away unseen spirits. The bruises were not accidents. They were marks of control. A bride who cried was told to remain silent. A bride who begged was told that her fear was weakness. And so she learned quickly to tremble in silence, to obey without words, and to hide her tears behind the veil. What awaited her at the altar was not kindness. The wedding ceremony was layered with secrets. Every step of it carried meanings she could not escape. When her hands were bound with rope or ribbon, it was not simply a sign of unity. It was a symbol of ownership. When she was made to circle the groom or kneel before him, it was not respect, it was submission. Each movement told her, from this moment forward, she belonged to him. In many villages, the bride was watched closely by strangers, elders, and neighbors. The entire community stood as judge, eager to see whether she would carry shame or honor. Their eyes were not gentle. Their stares cut deep. She was reminded again that this marriage was not about her wishes. It was a contract written in fear. If she faltered, her family's name would be stained. If she resisted, punishment would follow. The veil became heavier with every step. There were customs that twisted joy into cruelty. In some lands, the bride was lifted onto a chair and paraded through the streets. Laughter filled the air, but she was not laughing. Men joked about her body, made crude remarks, or tugged at her gown. The parade was not a welcome. It was humiliation disguised as festivity. In other places, brides were forced to perform tasks to prove their worth. Some carried heavy stones to show strength. Others endured painful rituals meant to test endurance. These trials were not traditions of love. They were warnings. They told her that marriage was not hers to enjoy. It was hers to survive. The veil shielded her from the crowd, but it could not shield her from fear. Every step closer to the altar felt like stepping further into a life chosen by others. Behind her, she left childhood, laughter, and freedom. Ahead of her was duty, obedience, and silence. The music grew louder. The air grew tighter. Her body felt as though it was sinking under invisible chains. On the surface, weddings appeared beautiful. The flowers, the feast, the music, all were arranged to hide the truth. But beneath the fragrance of roses lay the smell of control. Beneath the sweetness of cakes lay the bitterness of tears. A bride was taught to smile even as her heart cracked. She was told to bow her head, even as her spirit longed to flee. Those who dared to resist faced disgrace, sometimes even death. For in many societies, a woman's worth was bound to her obedience. To disobey meant ruin not only for herself, but for her entire family. The burden of honor was placed upon her shoulders, crushing her before she even reached the altar. The veil did not end with the ceremony. It followed her into the night. Behind closed doors, another ritual waited. The marriage bed was not always a place of tenderness. It was a place of proof. Villages demanded signs of blood, a cruel test of purity that turned intimacy into spectacle. Families gathered outside, waiting for evidence of virginity, as if love could be measured by pain. If blood appeared, the bride was praised. If not, suspicion fell upon her. Some were cast out, others beaten, and a few met darker fates. The veil that had hidden her face now seemed merciful compared to the shame that exposure could bring. Marriage was painted as holy, yet for countless brides, it was a ritual of fear. Each step, each chant, each symbol worked together to remind her one thing: she was no longer her own. From the moment the veil touched her skin, she was transformed. The girl who had once laughed in the fields or played by the river was gone. In her place stood a silent figure wrapped in shadows, presented as a wife, but marked as a possession. This was the truth that history tried to hide behind flowers and music. This was a face of matrimony not written in fairy tales, but in blood and tears. The veil did not simply hide a bride's face. It hid centuries of control. It hid voices that were silenced. It hid lives reshaped by rituals that cared nothing for love. And yet, even as she walked forward, trembling and silent, she knew she was not the first. Countless brides had stood where she stood, carrying the same fear, forced into the same obedience. Her story was not hers alone. It was a story of generations. The shadowed veil was more than a garment. It was a curse passed from mother to daughter, whispered from elder to child. It was a mask of marriage, the symbol of a world where love was twisted into fear. The veil did not only silence her voice, it sealed her fate. For long before a bride ever walked to the altar, her future had already been decided. She was never chosen for her laughter, her kindness, or the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of dreams. In many lands, a woman was chosen for something colder: her dowry. She was not seen as a soul with desires. She was measured like coin. Fathers and brothers gathered at wooden tables, their voices low, their faces hard. The young woman sat in the corner, silent, as if invisible. They did not ask her whom she loved, nor if her heart longed for another. They spoke of her as one might speak of cattle, weighing her value in gold, land, or livestock. Her body was a currency. Her marriage was a transaction. In wealthy families, the bargaining was almost theatrical. A daughter draped in silk was paraded as a jewel, her worth tied to the weight of her dowry chest. Gold coins stacked high, bolts of fine fabric, jewels passed down through generations. These became the true language of love. Suitors bowed not to the bride, but to the treasure her family promised. For poorer families, the tale was crueler. Their daughters were given away with little or nothing at all. Sometimes, the bride's body itself became the payment, her labor, her obedience, her silence offered as if these were currency enough. To marry without wealth was not freedom. It was slavery disguised as sacred vows. Whispers spread in markets and taverns. She is worth 3 fields of wheat. She brings 10 oxen. She brings nothing but a weak body. These words stained her name before her wedding day even came. A woman became her dowry. Her dowry became her identity. Love was never asked. Her price was her prison. Behind closed doors, the bargaining was darker still. Fathers struck deals with men twice her age, or with men already married, or with men whispered to be cruel. None of it mattered, so long as the gold flowed. The bride's tears were seen as weakness. Her silence was seen as obedience. In some regions, the negotiations turned vicious. Families broke alliances, betrayed blood, and even shed blood, all for a higher price. Some daughters were exchanged like weapons, their marriages ending feuds between clans or sealing dangerous pacts. They were not brides, they were shields, tools, sacrifices. Imagine a girl of 15, traded to a man old enough to be her grandfather. He looked at her not as a partner, but as proof of his wealth. His coins had purchased her. His name had claimed her. She walked beside him as one walks beside a captor. Her dowry chest glittered, but her spirit was crushed. Another girl, from a poor family, was sold for almost nothing. Her hands were calloused from work, her body frail. She was sent away without jewels, without land, without promise. Her dowry was her endurance, her ability to survive pain. Her husband's family mocked her, calling her the empty bride. For her, even shame was part of the payment. Some brides learned too late that dowries brought danger. A woman who carried a heavy dowry often found herself at risk. Greedy husbands poisoned their wives to seize the wealth sooner. Families plotted murders to reclaim riches once given away. A bride with too much gold became both valuable and disposable. Others, who carried nothing, found themselves cast aside, beaten, or traded again, like coins passed from one hand to another. And yet, society called it honor. They dressed the cruelty in words of duty and family pride. A father would boast, "My daughter's marriage brought us land." A brother would grin, "Her union gave us cattle." But no one asked the bride what her union gave her. For many, it gave only chains. Stories linger of brides who tried to resist. One girl refused to marry the man chosen for her, cried that she loved another. Her family beat her until her voice was gone. Another bride hid on the night of her wedding, but she was dragged back by her brothers, her dowry chest carried before her as if to remind her that her escape meant nothing. Resistance was always crushed. A dowry was never returned. The cruel irony was that even mothers, who had once endured the same fate, often became enforcers of the cycle. They whispered to their daughters, "Be silent. Accept. Your dowry is your only worth." They knew the pain but had been broken into believing there was no other way. So the chain tightened generation after generation. In certain places, dowries took strange and haunting forms. Some brides were given away with cursed objects, talismans meant to ward off evil but believed to carry misfortune if disrespected. Others were married with blood-soaked cloths or bones of ancestors as part of the exchange, binding the bride not only to her husband but to the ghost of his lineage. Her dowry was not simply wealth. It was a reminder that she was bound beyond life itself. And what of love? Love had no place in these exchanges. If a bride's heart longed for another, it was silenced. If she whispered her sorrow, it was ignored. Even as she stood before the altar with tears streaming down her face, the coin spoke louder than her voice. Love was a luxury. Love was a risk. Love was a forgotten word. The veil, heavy on her head, now seemed almost merciful. At least it hid her face while her worth was measured aloud. At least it allowed her to cry unseen as fathers haggled and brothers signed away her life. The world celebrated the bargain. The bells rang. The feast was prepared. Yet for the bride, each cheer sounded like chains clinking shut. Her dowry chest gleamed like treasure to others, but to her it was a coffin, a box that carried her away from herself, a box that marked her as sold. This was the price of a bride, a price that silenced voices, broke hearts, and chained women to men they did not choose. A price that placed gold above flesh, land above love, obedience above freedom. And still, the rituals deepened. The price was not enough. For beyond the bargaining of wealth waited darker trials, rites that stripped the bride even further of her will, her body, and her dignity. The price had been paid, the bargain sealed. But once the coins were counted and the land exchanged, a darker night awaited the bride. It was said that before she entered her husband's home, she must first pass through shadows. The wedding itself was not enough. She had to be tested, broken, and reshaped by rituals meant to strip away her last breath of freedom. The night before the ceremony was called a night of purification. But for the bride, it was a night of fear. In many villages, she was taken from her family and locked in a small chamber. The walls closed around her, silent and cold. No food was given, no water offered, no comfort allowed. She sat in darkness, trembling, her body weakening with every hour. This was no mistake. The elders wanted her weak. A frail bride was easier to control, easier to present as docile, easier to hand over like an object. Her cries were ignored. Her hunger was called cleansing. Her thirst was called sacred. And when her head drooped from exhaustion, they whispered that even her weakness was proof of obedience. In some lands, the silence was broken by something far crueler. Women gathered around the bride, carrying bundles of fresh branches cut from trees. With grim faces, they struck her arms, her back, her legs. Each blow was said to drive away unseen spirits. But the truth was darker. The strikes left bruises. The welt a reminder that her body no longer belonged to her. She was property now. She was flesh that could be struck without mercy. The sound of branches snapping against skin echoed in the night. The bride did not scream. She knew screams would only bring harder strikes. She endured silent, her tears hidden, her spirit cracking. Elsewhere, another ritual waited. Instead of branches, brides were covered in strange markings. Some were smeared with ash, black streaks across their skin, as if to remind them that they were leaving behind the light of childhood. Others were painted with animal blood, told that it was purity, told that it would protect them. But to the bride, the stench of blood and the weight of ash were chains. She was being rewritten. She was no longer a daughter. She was no longer herself. She was a vessel, prepared to serve, bound to obey. In some regions, the fear became even more grotesque. Brides were made to sit beside fires, the smoke choking their lungs, their hair burned at the ends as if to scorch away rebellion. Others had their nails torn short, or their faces veiled with heavy cloth, so they could barely breathe. Every custom carried the same message. You are not your own. Each mark, each scar, each ritual whispered the same curse. From this night forward, your body is no longer yours. It belongs to your husband. There were stories passed down of brides who resisted, who tried to flee before the rituals began. One slipped into the forest at night, only to be dragged back by her brothers at dawn, her body bound, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Another refused to submit to the whipping branches, only to be branded as cursed. She was said to carry demons, and so she was beaten until her spirit broke. No resistance was tolerated. Purity could not be questioned. Some rituals grew even stranger with superstition. In one village, brides were forced to drink bitter potions made from herbs and animal parts, mixtures that caused sickness and vomiting. The elders called it cleansing, but the bride knew it was nothing more than another way to weaken her. In another place, women were made to cut a small wound on their arms, letting blood drip onto the ground. It was said to be an offering to unseen gods, a sign of loyalty. But loyalty was never asked from the groom. Only the bride bled. Only the bride paid the price. The night dragged on like a curse. Hours passed with no rest, no comfort, no kindness. Brides were surrounded by women who had once endured the same fate. Their faces grim, their eyes empty. These older women enforced the rituals not out of cruelty, but because they too had been broken long ago. They told the young brides to be silent, to endure, to accept. They said obedience was survival. So the cycle repeated. Pain passed from mother to daughter, generation to generation, until no one remembered a time before the fear. And yet, for all the terror, the rituals were dressed in words of honor. Families spoke proudly of their daughters' endurance. Villages whispered of brides who bore the trials with dignity. The scars, the hunger, the tears, all were hidden beneath feasts and flowers the next day, as if the night of pain had never existed. But the bride remembered. Her body remembered. For her, the wedding morning was not a fresh start. It was a continuation of the nightmare. When the doors of her chamber opened, when the branches were set aside, when the blood dried on her skin, she was no longer herself. She was remade by fear. She walked to the altar hollow, trembling, already bound before vows were spoken. The veil hid her bruises. The smile painted on her lips was forced. No one asked why her eyes seemed so distant, why her steps were so heavy. They did not want the truth. They wanted the performance of a willing bride. And so the ritual of fear achieved its purpose. It erased the last pieces of rebellion, the last fragments of freedom. By the time she stood before her husband, she no longer belonged to herself. Her body had been struck, starved, painted, silenced. Her spirit had been cut open and reshaped. The vows that followed were meaningless, for the ritual had already spoken them. She was his, body and soul. This was the true beginning of marriage in many forgotten corners of history, not with love, not with tenderness, but with nights of hunger, pain, and blood, nights designed not to bless, but to bind. And though the next day brought music, flowers, and feasts, the memory of the ritual never left her. It stayed in her bones, in her scars, in her silence. The rituals of fear were only the first chain. Beyond them waited even greater silences, darker humiliations, and trials that would stretch far beyond the wedding night. The cloak of silence was waiting, ready to strip the bride of her last voice. The night of fear had passed, but the morning brought no freedom. The bruises faded beneath the gown, the marks hidden under layers of cloth. Yet the weight upon the bride only grew heavier. For now, a new ritual awaited her. It was not her body they sought to bind, but her voice. She was told that her words were dangerous, that a single sound from her lips might invite curses upon her marriage. And so, silence became her prison. In many lands, the veil was not simply a covering of modesty. It was thick, heavy, suffocating, a curtain that turned the bride into a shadow of herself. The fabric fell not only over her face, but over her voice. No one would see her trembling mouth. No one would hear her whispered fears. The veil ensured that her pain remained hidden, sealed away as though it never existed. But even without the veil, silence was demanded. Some cultures required brides to remain mute for days before their wedding. They were told that speech would anger the spirits, that their words might invite disaster. And so they endured long hours with sealed lips, even as questions burned inside them, even as tears threatened to break through. It was not protection. It was control. Imagine a young woman sitting in the corner of her home, her lips pressed shut, her family watching closely. Each time she tried to speak, her mother shook her head. Each time she opened her mouth, her brothers glared. The air grew heavy with unspoken words. She longed to ask why, longed to cry out, longed to say she was afraid. But she could not. The silence became unbearable, pressing down on her chest until she felt she could no longer breathe. Yet still she obeyed. For many brides, silence was not only a demand, it was punishment. In some villages, if a bride dared to speak before a wedding, her tongue was threatened with salt and ash. Some were forced to chew bitter herbs until their mouths burned, a cruel reminder that speech was forbidden. Others were locked away in chambers where they were commanded to stay voiceless, their cries muffled by walls too thick for anyone to hear. These punishments were not warnings of curses. They were tools of fear. The cloak of silence was not always physical. Sometimes it was carried through words. Elders whispered to young brides, "A woman who speaks too much brings shame." They told them, "Your silence is your honor. Your quiet is your gift." These whispers carved into their minds, shaping them into shadows long before they reached the altar. The world praised silent brides. A quiet woman was called pure. A voiceless wife was called obedient. Her silence was celebrated as virtue, even as it crushed her spirit. And yet, the silence held another purpose. It erased her power. For a woman who could not speak, could not refuse. A woman who could not voice her fear, could not resist. Her silence gave others a chance to decide her fate without challenge, to command her body without question, to strip her of her will without consequence. Her silence was not protection from curses. Her silence was the curse. Some stories speak of brides who broke the rule. One whispered to her friend on the eve of her wedding, confessing her terror. She was dragged before the elders, her head forced into cold water until she gasped and choked, her words drowned in punishment. Another bride cried out during the silent ritual, begging to be spared from her chosen husband. Her plea was met with laughter and scorn. They called her cursed and forced her into the marriage anyway. To speak was rebellion, and rebellion had no place in marriage. The cruelty lay not only in the punishment but in the secrecy. Families often told brides that silence was their protection, that demons lingered in the air, waiting for a woman's careless words to slip free. They whispered tales of brides who had spoken and were struck dead, or who had cursed their husbands with misery. These were lies. Lies designed to terrify, lies designed to bind. But the brides believed. How could they not? From childhood, they had been told that their words were dangerous, that their voices could shatter lives. They learned to bury their speech beneath fear. The cloak of silence did not lift once the wedding ended. It followed her into marriage. A bride who had learned to remain silent before the altar often remained silent for years after. She did not question when her husband grew cruel. She did not resist when she was beaten. She did not protest when her life was stolen piece by piece. The ritual had trained her too well. Her silence outlived the wedding. It became the foundation of her life. Even the veil, once lifted, left its shadow. Women recalled the heavy fabric, how it muffled their breath, how it blurred their vision. Some spoke of the moment when the veil was removed as a kind of death, for it was not her own hand that lifted it. It was his. The groom unveiled her, claimed her face as if it were treasure, revealed her tears not to comfort her, but to remind her that she was his possession. In that moment, her silence was complete. She could not speak even when unveiled, for her voice had long been stolen. The cruelest truth was that these silences were passed down like inheritance. Mothers who had been silenced taught their daughters the same obedience. They told them, "Endure your silence or your marriage will fail." They repeated the lies, not because they believed them, but because they had no choice. They were broken women teaching others how to survive. Thus, the cloak grew heavy with every generation, a fabric woven not a cloth, but fear, obedience, and despair. And yet, villages celebrated weddings as joyous occasions. They feasted, they sang, they laughed. But if one looked closer, the truth could be seen. Beneath the music, beneath the laughter, the bride sat silent, their smiles forced, their voices lost. The world praised their quiet as purity, but purity was only another name for control. The silence was never holy. It was never sacred. It was only a weapon. By the time the bride stood at the altar, she was not only bound by the veil, not only weakened by rituals of fear, she was stripped of her voice, stripped of her power, stripped of her last chance to resist. The silence became the final key that locked her in, and once locked, there was no escape. But silence was not the only cruelty waiting. Beyond the veil, beyond the muteness, another ritual loomed, one that would pierce even deeper. For when the wedding night came, the bride was no longer asked to be silent. She was asked to bleed. The silence of the bride was not the end of her trials. It was only the beginning. For once the vows were spoken, once the feast ended, once the music faded into the night, the true test awaited. A test not of faith or devotion, but of flesh. The wedding night was not treated as a moment of intimacy. It was treated as a courtroom, and the bed was the witness stand. Across many lands, families and entire villages waited outside closed doors, their ears pressed against the wood, their whispers circling like vultures. They were not waiting for laughter or joy. They were waiting for proof. Proof of pain. Proof of blood. The bride was told that her body must reveal her purity. She was told that the sheets would bear the mark of honor. She was told that without this crimson sign, her name and her family's name would collapse in disgrace. And so the chamber became a stage. What should have been private became a public spectacle. The young bride entered trembling, her gown heavy with expectation. Her husband did not enter as a partner, but as a judge. He knew the crowd outside waited for evidence. He knew his honor depended not on his own actions, but on her suffering. The pressure did not make him gentle. It made him cruel. She lay in silence, her heart pounding, knowing that her body was no longer her own. Her worth, her safety, her very life now rested on whether blood would stain white cloth. But the body does not always obey tradition. Not every woman bleeds. Not every union leaves proof. Nature did not follow custom, and so many innocent brides were condemned. If the sheets remained white, suspicion spread like wildfire. Whispers turned to accusations. She was not pure. She has betrayed us. Some families dragged their daughters from the bed before dawn, their heads bowed in shame. Others went further. There are tales of brides beaten, abandoned, even executed, all because a cruel ritual demanded proof where none could be given. In some places, midwives were called into chamber to act as witnesses. These women were ordered to inspect the bride's body, to search for signs of virginity, to judge her innocence with their own hands. Privacy was stripped away, dignity erased. The bride's body became evidence, her cries ignored, her shame displayed. And all the while, the villagers waited outside, eager for the outcome as though it were a festival. There were crueler customs still. Some grooms, desperate to protect their own honor, faked the evidence. They cut their own skin, staining the sheets with their blood. Others carried vials of animal blood, pouring it across the cloth to satisfy the watching crowd. In these twisted acts, lies became salvation, deceit became survival. But not all men were willing to protect their brides. Many stood coldly aside, allowing suspicion consume their wives, even encouraging punishment. For them, honor was not shared. It was demanded, and it was demanded at any cost. The test of blood was more than superstition. It was a weapon. It turned a natural, private act into a public trial. It reduced a woman's worth to a single night, a single stain, a single moment of pain. If she passed, she was praised, but only as property delivered intact. If she failed, she was destroyed. In both fates, she was never free. Stories survive of brides who tried to escape the ritual. One, knowing her body might not bleed, cut her hand in secret and pressed it to the sheets. She lived, but carried the scar forever, a reminder that her safety had been bought with blood not meant for love. Another bride begged her husband to protect her, but he refused. When dawn came and the sheets remained white, she was dragged into the square and stoned by her own kin. Her crime was silence. Her crime was innocence. But the ritual demanded blood, and so blood was taken. The cruelty spread across cultures, dressed in different clothing, but carrying the same message. In some lands, red cloth was waved from windows as proof, greeted with cheers and songs. In others, the sheet itself was paraded through the village, a banner of supposed honor. Everywhere, the bride's body became public property. Her suffering turned into entertainment. Her dignity reduced to spectacle. The sheet became more important than her life. And what of the husbands? They bore no such test. Their purity was never questioned. Their worth was never reduced to blood. They walked into marriage free of scrutiny, while their brides carried the burden of impossible proof. It was not equality. It was domination, woven into the very fabric of the wedding bed. The test of blood did more than terrify brides. It poisoned marriages from the very beginning. Trust was replaced by fear. Love was replaced by suspicion. A union that should have begun with tenderness instead began with humiliation. Some women, though innocent, never escaped the stain of doubt. Whispers followed them through life. Husbands treated them as traitors. Families shunned them. Villages cursed their names. The ritual had stolen not only their wedding night, but their entire future. And yet, the world called it honor. The elders praised it as sacred. The villagers cheered when the sheets were stained, blind to the cruelty behind the crimson. They claimed purity was protected, families preserved. But in truth, what was preserved was control. Control over women, control over their bodies, control over their lives. The test of blood was never about love. It was never about faith. It was about power. There were rare tales of resistance. In one village, women gathered together and refused to allow their daughters to be tested. They claimed that blood was not proof, that dignity mattered more. For a brief time, they triumphed, but the men of the village retaliated, enforcing the ritual with greater cruelty than before. Change was crushed. Fear endured. The bride, lying in silence beneath her husband, understood the truth with every beat of her heart. This night was not for her. It was for them, for the waiting families, for the gossiping neighbors, for the honor of men who cared nothing for her pain. Her body was not her own. It belonged to a crowd outside the door. And when dawn came and the sheet was displayed, her life would be judged not by her character, not by her soul, but by a single stain of red or by the absence of it. This was a test of blood, a ritual that turned love into trial, intimacy into spectacle, and brides into sacrifices. But the cruelty of marriage rituals did not end here. For even after the blood was shown, even after honor was claimed, darker rites still waited. Some brides were made to face death itself, carried through the village as if they had already died. The bed had spoken, the sheet had been shown. Blood or no blood, the bride was judged, measured, and marked forever. But even this was not enough. In many places, the wedding did not end with proof of honor. It moved to something darker, something that blurred the line between love and death. For some traditions treated marriage itself as a funeral. In forgotten corners of Europe, the bride was laid in a wooden coffin before her husband. She did not lie there as a corpse, but as a symbol. It was said her old life had ended. Childhood was buried. Freedom was buried. Her name, her will, her laughter, all lowered into the coffin with her. The villagers watched as men carried her through the streets. The crowd did not mourn. They celebrated. Drums pounded. Songs rang out, as if death itself were festivity. But to the bride, the weight of the coffin was real. Each creak of the wood reminded her that she was being carried not toward love, but toward burial. In other places, she was not placed in a coffin, but wrapped in mourning clothes. Black veils draped her head. Black robes covered her body. She looked less like a bride and more like a widow, grieving for a life not yet lost. But the truth was clear. She was being taught that marriage was not a birth of happiness, but the death of herself. Her new life began with the end of her old one. These rituals were not only symbolic, they were warnings. A bride dressed for death understood that she was expected to obey, to remain silent, to endure. If her wedding day began like a funeral, what hope was there for joy in the days that followed? The coffin, the mourning clothes, the mock funeral procession, all carried the same message. She was no longer her own. She had been buried alive in the role of wife. There are chilling tales of brides who trembled as they were carried through villages. Children ran alongside, laughing, throwing flowers as if mocking the death of freedom. Elders nodded with approval, praising the ritual as holy. But the bride's heart pounded with dread. She was alive, yet forced to perform her own burial. Some women fainted inside their coffins, overcome with terror and suffocation. Others wept openly beneath their mourning veils. Yet their cries were ignored, for the ritual was not meant to comfort them. It was meant to strip them of their final resistance. In some cultures, the bride was made to sit beside an open grave, as if staring into her own end. Stones were placed in her lap, symbolizing the weight of her new duties. Soil was sprinkled over her hair, marking her as one who no longer belonged to the living world of choice and freedom. She was now bound to duty, bound to her husband, bound to silence. This mockery of death did not kill her body. It killed her identity. The cruelty deepened in places where brides were forced to perform acts of mourning for themselves. Some lit candles and stood in silence as if keeping vigil for their own passing. Others recited prayers not for the dead, but for themselves, declaring the end of their former lives. These rituals blurred the line between wedding and funeral until the two became indistinguishable. To love was to die. To marry was to vanish. Why did such customs survive? Elders claimed they were reminders of duty. They said a bride must die to her past, so she could live for her husband. They said mourning was necessary, for her freedom was gone. But beneath these justifications lay control. The rituals worked because they terrified women into obedience. A bride who had already died in ritual could not rise to resist. There are stories of brides who tried to escape these macabre customs. One refused to enter the coffin, but her family forced her inside, nailing the lid shut before carrying her through the streets. She survived the ritual, but her screams haunted the village for years. Another tore off her mourning veil and fled, only to be dragged back and beaten until her spirit broke. The rituals were called sacred, but they were cages disguised as ceremony. What made these traditions most cruel was their deception. To the villagers, they seemed symbolic, almost playful. To the bride, they were nightmares. The crowd saw laughter, but she saw death. The world saw a celebration, but she felt burial. It was a performance of obedience, written not in joy, but in despair. And when the coffin was set down, when the veil was lifted, when the mock funeral ended, the bride was no longer the same. She had been stripped of her past, stripped of her will, stripped of her identity. She stood before her husband like a figure risen from a grave, not alive, but bound. The mockery of death lingered long after the wedding. Brides who had been carried in coffins spoke of feeling haunted, as though their souls had been left behind in the boxes that bore them. Those who wore mourning veils felt as though they had been widowed before they were even wed. The rituals left scars deeper than any wound. And yet, the traditions endured, passed from one generation to the next, dressed in the language of honor. This was marriage for many brides, not a passage into love, but descent into silence and shadows. The rituals of fear had weakened their bodies. The cloak of silence had erased their voices. The test of blood had stolen their dignity. And now, the mockery of death buried their very identities. What remained of them was not woman, not daughter, not self. What remained was only wife. But even death was not the final cruelty. For after the coffin was closed and the veil was lifted, the bride still faced another stage of torment. At the feast that followed, when tables overflowed with food and wine, the rituals continued. Hidden within the laughter of the wedding meal were acts of control, humiliation, and submission. The coffin had been set down, the mourning veils removed. The village declared the bride reborn, but not as herself, as a wife bound by chains she could not see. Yet her trials did not end at the altar or the grave-like procession. They followed her into the celebration that should have been hers. For even the wedding feast, rich with food and wine, carried its own cruel rituals. What looked like joy was only another performance of control. The tables were heavy with bread, roasted meats, and bowls of fruit. Candles flickered across the hall, casting shadows against stone walls. Guests laughed, clinking their cups, their voices filling the air with cheer. To any stranger, it would seem a night of plenty, a celebration of union. But for the bride, the feast was no gift. It was a test. She was not free to eat as she wished. She was not free to drink with ease. Every bite carried meaning. Every swallow carried weight. The foods placed before her were not chosen for taste, but for torment. In many lands, brides were given bitter herbs, sharp on the tongue and cruel to the stomach. These were said to remind her that marriage was not sweetness but suffering, that her life ahead would not be filled with joy but with endurance. Each bitter mouthful was a warning. Do not expect tenderness. Elsewhere, the rituals grew more grotesque. Some brides were forced to drink blood, believing that consuming it would bind her to her husband, body, and soul. In certain villages, animal hearts or livers were placed before her. The raw flesh, a symbol of strength she was expected to swallow. She was told that pain in her stomach would prepare her for pain in her life. Her wedding feast became a banquet of suffering. There were places where the cruelty came not for what she was forced to eat, but from what she was denied. Brides were forbidden food altogether, left to sit weak and trembling while guests filled their plates. Laughter echoed around her, while hunger gnawed at her insides. She was told this was a lesson, that her body no longer belonged to her hunger, but to her husband's command. She was displayed like a jewel at the table, yet starved like a beggar. The guests rarely noticed her pain. They drank, they cheered, they sang. To them, the feast was abundance. To her, it was submission. Every moment reminded her that she was no longer free, not even in the simple act of eating. And when she faltered, when the bitterness overwhelmed her or the hunger weakened her, the whispers began. Some called her ungrateful. Others said she lacked strength. Even in cruelty, blame always found her. In some regions, the rituals grew stranger still. A bride might be ordered to serve food to her husband first, bowing low as she placed his plate before him. While her own plate remained empty, others were forced to crawl beneath the table to retrieve scraps, as if to show that even in celebration, her place was lower. The feast, which had been her moment of honor, became a stage of humiliation. There were tales of brides who resisted, who refused the bitter foods or pushed away the cups of blood. But resistance brought punishment. One was forced to stand in the hall while guests jeered. Her refusal called a curse upon the marriage. Another was denied her dowry, her own family turning against her for shaming them at the table. To disobey was to invite disgrace. To obey was to surrender. The cruelty was not hidden. It was paraded before all, cloaked in song and laughter so that the world would not call it torture. They called it tradition, sacred and binding. They said the bitter foods made a woman strong, that the blood united her with her husband, that the hunger taught her discipline. But the truth was simpler. The feast was never hers. It was theirs to shape her, theirs to weaken her, theirs to remind her that she belonged not to herself, but to obedience. What made it most chilling was how the feast blurred the line between joy and cruelty. To the villagers, the bride's trembling hands and downcast eyes looked like shyness. Her forced silence appeared as modesty. Her refusal to eat seemed like grace. The cruelty was invisible to those who did not wish to see. But to the bride, every swallow of bitterness was a wound. Every sip of blood was a chain. Every moment of hunger was a reminder that she was being reshaped, stripped of her voice, her strength, herself. Even the music carried its own weight. Songs were sung to remind her of duty, verses whisper of obedience, refrains that warned of punishment for wives who disobeyed. The melodies rose like celebration, but the words fell like curses. She sat at the center of the feast, but she was not celebrated. She was tested, measured, judged. Some brides never forgot the taste of their wedding feasts. One spoke of the bitterness that lingered on her tongue for years, a taste she could never wash away. Another remembered the hunger, the ache in her stomach as she sat surrounded by plenty, but denied even bread. These memories outlasted the songs, the laughter, even the vows. The feast remained a wound. And yet, families spoke of these rituals with pride. Fathers boasted that their daughters endured. Mothers whispered that their girls obeyed. The world praised the cruelty as honor. No one asked the bride what she felt. The feast of control was not about food. It was about power. It was a reminder that every part of her life, even the simple act of eating, was no longer her own. It belonged to her husband, her family, her village, to the rituals that bound her tighter with every step. And once the feast ended, when the candles burned low and the laughter died, her trials did not fade. For even as she rose from the table, weakened and humiliated, another terror waited. The night after the feast was not hers alone. For in some places, marriage meant she belonged not only to her husband, but to strangers as well. The feast had ended, the laughter fading into the night. The bride, weakened by ritual, humiliated by custom, was led from the hall. To any watching villager, it seemed the night belonged to her and her husband at last. But in some places, the wedding bed was not hers to share with him alone. A darker tradition lurked beyond the feast, one that stripped her of even the dignity left to her. In certain lands, it was believed that the groom did not have the first right to his bride. That right belonged to others, men of power, priests of the church, nobles of court, or even the groom's closest friends. They claimed it as ancient law, as custom passed through generations. They called it sacred. They called it privilege. But for the bride, it was torment. She had been bartered like treasure, silenced like a shadow, tested with blood, buried in ritual, mocked at the table. And now, at the moment she should have found rest, she was handed to strangers. Her body became property, not her husband, but of men who saw her only as proof of their rank. It was known as the rite of the first night. The villagers whispered of it with unease, yet still it endured. For the bride, it meant that her first hours of marriage were not spent with a man she was bound to, but with others who claimed her as theirs. Some were forced into chambers with priests, told it was a blessing, that lying with holy men would purify their wounds. Others were delivered to nobles, whose touch was not gentle, but cold with entitlement. And in some places, even the groom's friends shared in the cruelty, laughing as if the bride were a trophy passed from hand to hand. The shame was unbearable. She was stripped of dignity, stripped of privacy, stripped of any illusion that marriage could hold even a trace of safety. Her husband watched, silent or approving, for his honor was not stained by her humiliation. It was only hers to bear. And when the doors opened the next morning, the villagers cheered, never questioning the horror she endured. To them, it was custom. To her, it was violation. There are tales of brides who resisted. One screamed as the priest approached, clawing at the walls, begging for mercy, but her cries were muffled with cloth. Her body pinned until the ritual was complete. Another tried to flee the chamber, but she was dragged back by her own family, her dowry chest thrown at her feet, as if to remind her that she had been bought. Resistance meant nothing. The right was never hers to refuse. In some places, the ritual took on crueler forms. Brides were paraded before groups of men, stripped of their gowns, touched and mocked under the guise of tradition. Others were sent into chambers where multiple men awaited, their laughter echoing long into the night. These were not whispers of legend. They were histories carved in shame, carried through generations of silence. The night of strangers turned marriage into nightmare. What made it most bitter was the secrecy. Elders claimed the ritual was sacred, yet was cloaked in shadows. They spoke of it as duty, yet knew it was cruelty. They behind the language of law and custom, but at its heart was greed, lust, and power. The bride's body became the stage upon which men displayed authority. She was no longer daughter, no longer wife, no longer woman. She was possession. And yet, the world celebrated the marriage. The feast continued. The songs were sung. Villages called to honor that noble blood touched the bride, that priests blessed her with their presence. But the truth was whispered only in the silence of the women who had endured it. Their eyes carried the weight of betrayal. Their silence the scars of humiliation. The world looked away. Some stories tell of husbands who tried to protect their brides, hiding them away, refusing the ritual. But these men were punished. Their marriages were declared unlawful, their lands taken, their families shamed. No man's honor could outweigh tradition. Others willingly surrendered their wives, believing it brought them power, that the blessing of nobles or priests made their union stronger. They stood proud, even as their brides wept. The betrayal was complete. For the bride, the night of strangers was the cruelest lesson. It showed her that her marriage was not truly hers, that her body would never be her own, that even in her most private moment she was public property. It stripped her the last illusion of safety, reminding her that she belonged not to love, but to a system built on power and obedience. And still, she rose the next morning. She dressed, she smiled, she performed the role of wife. As if nothing had been taken from her, the world demanded it. To show her pain would be to dishonor her family. To speak of her shame would be to invite punishment. So she swallowed her despair and carried it into her new life. But though she walked forward, the night of strangers remained with her. It lived in her silence, in her empty gaze, in the hollow sound of her footsteps. It lived in the children she bore, children who may not even belong to her husband, but whom the world still called his. It lived in her body, in the wounds left behind by a ritual that turned intimacy into violation, that transformed her into property, that reduced her to nothing more than a vessel. This was marriage for many forgotten brides, not the union of two souls, but the possession of one by many, not a promise of safety, but a chain of humiliation. The night of strangers was not legend. It was history. It was a shadow behind the feast, the horror that followed laughter, the betrayal hidden in vows. But even this cruelty was not the end. Beyond the humiliation of strangers, beyond the violation of the wedding bed, other chains waited. For in many lands, superstition itself would bind the bride. Stones, bones, flames, and curses were forced upon her, as if fear alone could shape her obedience. The night of strangers had ended. Yet peace did not come. Even after humiliation, after blood, after silence, another layer of control awaited the bride. For in many lands, her life was bound not only by men, but by the invisible world of spirits, curses, and unseen forces. Superstition was woven into every step of her marriage, and it became yet another chain. From the moment she woke on her wedding morning, she was dressed not only in fabric, but in talismans. Stones were sewn into the folds of her gown, heavy against her skin. Some were meant to keep away death. Others were meant to weigh her down, to remind her that her steps were no longer her own. She carried them without question, told that to refuse was to invite ruin upon her marriage. In other places, nails were hidden in her dress, pressed against her body as she walked. They said iron would ward off spirits, that sharp edges would cut away curses. But the nails dug into her skin, pricking her flesh, leaving marks she could not show. Each step was pain disguised as protection. And still she obeyed. The charms grew stranger still. Some brides were forced to carry animal bones, slipped into the seams of their gowns, a rib from a lamb, a claw from a bird, even the skulls of small creatures. Elders claimed these bones trapped evil before it reached her. But to the bride, the weight of the dead pressed against her, a grim reminder that her marriage was bound to superstition, to fear, to death. She was not free. She was haunted. Her hair, once a symbol of her youth, was often taken from her. Long locks were cut away, tossed into fire, or buried beneath doorsteps. They said the strands could hold spirits, that they must be destroyed to keep the bride pure. But in truth, it was another act of control. Her beauty, her identity, her freedom, all sheared away in the name of safety. Brides wept as their hair fell, their childhood burned to ash, yet the world praised it as holy. Some rituals brought fire to her skin. Flames were passed across her body, scorching close, burning lightly, as if pain could cleanse her sin. The fire was said to purify, to chase away unseen curses. But the bride felt only terror, the heat licking her skin, the smell of smoke wrapping her like a shroud. She endured, silent, knowing that to flinch was to show weakness, that to resist was to bring shame. And these were not the only chains. In certain places, brides were forced to drink bitter liquids mixed with ash or blood, told that the spirits would not harm a woman who tasted death. Others were made to spit upon sacred ground, believing it would seal their fate, that even their breath must be bound to ritual. Every gesture, every swallow, every step became part of a web of superstition. What made it more chilling was how these customs passed down without question. Mothers who had suffered them told their daughters the same stories. They whispered, "Carry the stone, or death will find you. Let them cut your hair, or spirits will take your children. Accept the flame, or your marriage will fail." Fear became inheritance. Terror became tradition. There are tales of brides who resisted, who tore charms from their gowns, who refused to drink the bitter potions, who cried out when the flames came too close. But their defiance was crushed. One was beaten until her skin bore darker scars than fire ever could. Another was cast out, her marriage declared cursed before it even began. The rituals were stronger than rebellion. Even in death, superstition followed them. Some brides, buried years later, were found with stones still in their coffins, nails clasped in their hands, bones sewn into their shrouds. The chains they carried in life clung to them in death, proof that fear had bound them until their final breath. Their voices were lost, their choices erased, their lives reduced to charms and curses. The cruelest truth was not that people believed in spirits. The cruelest truth was that these superstitions gave men and elders power. By cloaking cruelty in the name of protection, they disguised obedience as survival. They convinced women that fear was their duty, that pain was their blessing, that silence was their safety. And so the chains tightened not only around their bodies, but around their minds. Some villages celebrated the rituals with festivals. They danced as brides carried charms. They laughed as hair was cut. They sang as flames brushed the skin of trembling women. What was torment for her was spectacle for them. They cheered, blind to the fear in her eyes. To them, superstition was tradition. To her, it was prison. The bride, weighed down by stones, burned by flames, stripped of hair, walked forward in silence. Her heart still longed for love, still dreamed of freedom, but each ritual told her those things no longer belonged to her. Her duty was to obey. Her fate was to endure. Her chains were invisible, yet heavier than iron. And so she stepped deeper into a life where fear itself had become law. But superstition was not the final cruelty. Beyond charms and curses, beyond stones and flames, there was one last binding, the eternal vow that turned marriage not into love, but into a cage from which there was no escape. The chains of superstition had done their work. The stones, the bones, the flames, the silence, the blood, all the rituals had reshaped her. By the end of it all, the bride was no longer herself. The girl who once laughed beneath the sun, who once dreamed of love, who once carried a voice of her own, she was gone. What stood in her place was a figure molded by fear, trained by obedience, trapped by duty. The marriage was called a union, but it was not a joining of two souls. It was the death of one, so the other might claim power. She walked forward into her new life as if through a corridor of shadows. Each step echoed with the rituals she had endured. The locked chambers, the whips of branches, the painted blood, the cloak of silence, the humiliations of strangers, the charms sewn into her gown, all followed her like ghosts. She was not free of them. She carried them in her bones. Even her smile, forced upon her lips of the crowd, was no longer hers. It belonged to the performance of obedience. Her silence belonged to the weight of curses whispered by elders. Her body belonged to her husband, and to the rituals that claimed her long before he did. What should have been a celebration of love had become a theater of control. The flowers covered bruises. The music drowned out sobs. The feast masked hunger. The veil hid tears. Every part of the wedding was an illusion. A curtain pulled across the stage, so the world would not see the suffering behind it. But if one listened closely, beyond the songs and the laughter, one could hear the muffled screams, the whispered prayers, the broken breaths of brides who walked not into love, but into cages. History remembers weddings as joyous. Stories tell of laughter, of feasts, of unions blessed by family and faith. But hidden beneath those tales lies another truth, a truth written in blood and silence, a truth spoken only in shadows. Love in the past was not always tender. It was a weapon sharpened against innocent. It was a contract written not in devotion but in chains. And sometimes it was a curse. The eternal binding was not sealed by vows or rings. It was sealed by fear. Once the bride was reshaped, there was no returning to who she had been. The rituals left no escape. She carried them for life, and many carried them to the grave. Some were buried with the stones sewn into their gowns. Others lay in coffins still marked by ashes and blood. Even in death, they bore the chains of marriage, chains they had never chosen. The world called them wives, but in truth, they were captives. Yet, within these stories of cruelty, betrayal, and torment, there is something more. There is revelation. By looking into these dark chambers of history, we see the truths that were hidden, the voices that were silenced, the lives that were reshaped. These stories remind us that love is not only roses and vows. It is also control, power, secrecy, and danger. History has tried to bury the side of marriage beneath flowers and music, but the shadows remain. And in the shadows, the truth waits. The bride, forever bound, is a symbol of how society used rituals not to bless, but to bind. A symbol of how love can be twisted into control, of how vows can be turned into prisons. She stands in memory, veiled, silent, carrying her chains. And as we look back through history, her figure still walks beside us, reminding us of what was hidden. You've just stepped into the world of dark courtships, where history's forbidden truths are uncovered, where love is revealed not as fairy tale, but as shadow. If these stories left you unsettled, if they made you see love and marriage through darker eyes, then stay with us. There are many more secrets waiting, more rituals hidden in dust, more scandals whispered in silence, more tales of love twisted into fear. Like this story, share with those who dare to know what history tried to hide, and subscribe to join us as we open more of history's forbidden letters. The chamber is not yet empty. The past is not yet silent. The darkness still holds countless stories. Step deeper with us if you are willing.